I keep thinking about the way her message lit up my phone that night. The way the screen burned against the dark like it had something urgent to confess before I even opened it. And maybe that's why I'm writing this now, at 3-something in the morning, trying to figure out how things started unraveling long before she wrote the words "we need to talk." Because the truth is the unraveling didn't start with that message but with all the nights before it. The nights when I pretended I wasn't watching the way she breathed when she thought no one was paying attention. The nights when I tried to convince myself that wanting something badly enough might make it shift, might make it lean toward me just a little, even if she never said anything outright that suggested it would happen. And maybe that's the part I should have paid attention to, the silence under her silence. The kind that doesn't promise anything and doesn't owe explanation. The space I kept trying to step into without her ever inviting me. It always starts simple, at least that's what I tell myself now. Like the first night I walked her home after drinks with friends and she laughed at something I said. That small warm sound that seemed too soft for how cold the street was. And I remember thinking that maybe there was potential in the way she tilted her head. But when I asked if she wanted to get dinner sometime just the two of us, she smiled the kind of smile someone gives when they're already putting distance behind their eyes. Soft and polite and impossible to argue with. And said not now, maybe later, maybe when things calm down. I didn't know what things she meant, but I took the maybe as something real, a placeholder for whatever future I thought might fall into place if I waited just right. After that, it became a pattern I pretended not to notice. I'd find myself at her apartment after a few too many nights of feeling restless, telling myself I just happened to be in the neighborhood. But the truth is I kept rehearsing excuses in my head on the way over, trying to make my presence seem accidental even though it never was. She'd open the door with that same soft expression, the one that made me feel like she was letting me into a place I didn't fully deserve to be, and we'd sit on her couch with some show playing in the background. Something she liked and I pretended to follow while really I was watching the way she curled her legs under herself, the way she pulled her sleeves over her hands when she got cold. Small gestures that made me feel closer to her in some quiet way I couldn't explain. And at the end of those nights, after enough moments that felt like they could have tipped into something else, if either of us nudged, I'd try again. Sometimes it was subtle, like brushing her hand when I passed her the remote or letting my knee linger against hers for half a second longer than necessary. Other times I'd be more direct, asking if she wanted to go somewhere with me on the weekend. Somewhere that wasn't her living room or the bar we both pretended we didn't frequent just for a chance to run into each other. Every time, the answer was the same. A small shake of her head, a soft smile, a quiet maybe next time. And every time, I told myself that next time meant something, that she wasn't saying no, not really, just not yet. I think that's where the frustration started. Not the kind that rises like a sharp thing ready to break, but the slow, steady kind that sits in your chest like a stone you keep forgetting is there until you breathe too deeply and feel it again. I'd walk home after those nights with my hands shoved deep in my pockets, not because of the cold but because I didn't know what else to do with them. Feeling that mix of disappointment and something else I didn't want to name. I kept telling myself I wasn't obsessed, that I wasn't one of those people who mistake attention for connection. But sometimes I'd replay her rejections in my mind like they were scenes from a film I was trying to analyze, searching for something in her tone or her eyes that suggested she didn't mean what she said. Something that proved there was a version of the story where she said yes. There wasn't. And yet the more she turned me down, the more I found myself drawn to her in ways I couldn't articulate. It wasn't about wanting to win or wanting to prove anything. It was quieter than that, a kind of fascination with the way she moved through the world. The way she seemed both close and far at the same time. I started noticing details I'm not sure most people would pick up on. Like how she always tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking. Or how she paused before answering questions, as if she weighed every word before letting it out. It wasn't romantic. Not exactly. It was more like studying a pattern you don't fully understand but can't look away from. Sometimes, on the nights when she didn't let me linger too long and sent me home earlier than I wanted, I'd feel something unfamiliar pulling at me, not anger but a kind of empty ache, a quiet resentment that I kept pushing down because I told myself that people had the right to say no. And I believed that, truly, but the part of me that wanted her kept feeling like I was being held at arm's length, close enough to stay hopeful but far enough to never move forward. She wasn't cruel. She never played with me, never gave mixed signals. Everything she said was clear. Everything I ignored was on me. But clarity doesn't soften longing, and longing doesn't listen to reason. And the nights kept folding into each other, until they all felt the same, me asking in some form or another, her declining with gentle precision, and me leaving quietly, telling myself I didn't mind. The thing is, rejection doesn't always come like a sudden drop. Sometimes it comes like erosion, slow and patient, wearing down whatever boundary you thought you had until you're standing in a place you don't recognize, wondering how you ended up there. I'd lie awake after those nights replaying everything, feeling the frustration settle deeper, mingling with something sharper, something like curiosity but darker at the edges. It wasn't that I wanted to change her mind. It was that I wanted to understand why mine wouldn't change at all. Maybe that's when the fascination started turning into something else. Something that made me pay attention to patterns without meaning to. Something that made me listen more carefully when she talked about her schedule or the things she liked to do alone. I never pushed. I never argued with her, no. But the repeated no's started to draw outlines in my mind, shapes of routines she never intended to share with me, details she probably didn't realize she offered. And every time I walked home afterward, that quiet resentment grew a little heavier. Not enough to tip into anything dramatic, just enough to make me pull the memories closer, studying them the way someone might study an unfinished puzzle. She didn't know any of that, of course. To her, I was just someone who asked a little too often and took the rejection quietly. Someone persistent but not alarming, someone she trusted enough to let into her apartment on nights when she didn't want to be alone but didn't want company either. Someone almost close, but not enough to matter. I kept telling myself that was enough. And then came the message from her girls' weekend, the one that said we need to talk. I want to date other people, and the moment I saw it, everything that had been quietly building in me shifted. Not with anger, not with heartbreak, but with a kind of cold clarity I hadn't expected. But that's the beginning of part 2, and I'm not there yet. All I know is that before that message, before everything that followed, there were all these nights of asking and being refused. Nights of quiet exits and unspoken frustration. Nights when I kept thinking maybe, until the maybes hollowed out into something else entirely. After her message, something in me settled in a way I didn't expect. Not with anger or shock, but with a kind of muted acceptance. Like hearing a door close in another room and realizing you'd already known it would happen. And maybe that's what made the days afterward feel strangely steady. As if the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting because there was nothing left to anticipate or interpret, only the quiet that followed. I didn't respond to her message right away. I didn't need to. I let it sit there on my screen like a final punctuation mark on a sentence that had always been winding toward that point. And instead of replaying all the nights she told me maybe next time, I found myself thinking about the patterns that had formed around those nights, the details I'd picked up without meaning to, the little rhythms of her life that had woven themselves into the edges of my attention. I don't think she ever realized how much she repeated herself in ways that weren't verbal, how her habits left a trail of consistency that anyone paying close enough attention could follow. I'm not saying I followed her. That isn't what this is. It's quieter than that, more passive. Like noticing the way someone always touches the same part of the counter when they walk into the kitchen, or how they leave their keys slightly angled to the right on the table. Patterns reveal themselves whether you want them to or not. And once they do, you can't unsee them. After I left her place on those nights, I'd walk the same route home, cutting through the same few blocks, thinking about the tone of her voice when she said no, the small tilt of her head that always accompanied it, the almost apologetic softness that made the rejection feel less like a barrier and more like a door she kept gently closing before I could step through. It wasn't bitterness that made me think about her habits afterward. It was something calmer, a kind of intellectual curiosity that settled over me the way a late-night air settles over empty streets. I began to notice that she always woke up early on weekdays, earlier than most people I knew, because her lights would flicker on around the same time whenever I happened to be walking past her building after one of my insomnia-driven late-night loops around the neighborhood. I didn't do it intentionally at first. The route was familiar, convenient, one I'd taken for years before I even met her. But once I realized her window glowed at a consistent hour, I found myself glancing up without meaning to. Just a quick flick of my eyes to see if the pattern held. It always did. She moved through her apartment the same way each morning, kitchen first, then living room, then bathroom, a sequence so steady it could have been choreographed. I knew this not because I was watching constantly, but because sometimes, when my own restlessness pulled me from sleep, I'd find myself drifting toward the street where she lived, letting the quiet pre-dawn air clear my head. I'd keep to the opposite sidewalk, my hands shoved into my pockets, my mind half asleep. and every now and then I'd catch the silhouette of her crossing a room behind the thin curtains she never bothered to replace. It never felt invasive. It felt observational, like studying the way leaves move in a predictable wind. There's something soothing about routine, even someone else's, especially when your own life sits slightly out of focus. The more I noticed, the more the patterns began to take shape in my thoughts, not as a map or a plan, but as something like a narrative thread. She always made tea around midday when she worked from home, because on days when I passed her building, at lunchtime I'd see steam fogging the window above her sink. She liked to leave her balcony door cracked open even when it was cold, something I figured out from the way the curtains fluttered lightly in the draft. She hummed when she cooked, not a tune I recognized, just a soft, steady sound that carried faintly into the hallway when I visited, and once I realized it, I heard it every time afterward. None of this meant anything. Not really. But meaning wasn't what I was after. It was the noticing that mattered, the quiet act of paying attention. After she sent that message from her girls' weekend, I didn't see her for a few days, and instead of feeling the absence like a sting, I felt it like space, a kind of buffer that let me observe things in a way I hadn't before. I didn't text her, didn't ask what she meant or why she felt the need to say it in such a blunt way. I didn't need clarification. Her words fit neatly into the gaps formed by all the subtle rejections before, and once I accepted them, everything else seemed to sharpen. I found myself remembering things she'd mentioned offhand: what time she usually got groceries, which cafe she liked for a late breakfast, the days she tutored a kid from the neighborhood, and those details slotted into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been looking at for months, without realizing I was assembling it. It wasn't obsessive. It wasn't even deliberate. It was more like taking inventory of a familiar room after someone rearranges the furniture, noticing what had always been there. Sometimes I'd pass her grocery store and wonder if she had already been there that morning, imagining her moving down the aisles with her slow, thoughtful pace, reading labels even when she bought the same things every week. Other times I'd walk by the cafe and glance through the window, not expecting to see her but picturing her sitting at the table by the wall, the one she preferred because it gave her a view of the whole room. I wasn't looking for her. I was remembering her in motion, and memory has a way of filling in details even when the moment isn't happening in front of you. What surprised me, though, was how calm I felt during all this. There was no frustration left, no resentment pulling at me the way it had before. It was as if her message had removed the last variable, leaving behind only the quiet sum of everything I'd noticed about her. I didn't want to fix anything. I didn't want to confront her or win her back or argue with the finality of what she'd said. I just watched without interfering, without intruding. It felt like a way to understand the shape her presence had carved into my routines without needing her to participate in it. A kind of quiet fixation, steady and unhurried. Sometimes I wondered if she sensed any of this, the way people sometimes feel eyes on them even when no one is looking, but I doubted it. She moved through her days with the same gentle confidence she always had, walking with her headphones in, her gaze soft but unfocused, as if she lived slightly removed from the world around her. It made her seem delicate in a way that wasn't fragility but a kind of unintentional transparency, like her life was easy to read if you knew what to look for. And I did. I knew when she stopped at the bodega near her place because she always paused for a moment before going in, adjusting her scarf even when it wasn't crooked. I knew she liked to take the long route home from the gym on Thursdays, the one that passed the small park with the broken lamppost. I knew she checked her mailbox twice a day even though she rarely received anything. None of this was dramatic. None of it was sinister. It was observational in the purest sense, an accumulation of familiar details settling into my mind like dust on a forgotten shelf. And the more I noticed, the more I understood that my fixation wasn't about wanting something from her anymore. It was about the quiet satisfaction of understanding the patterns of a person who had unknowingly shaped so many of my nights. She didn't know I paid attention. She didn't know how her routines had become landmarks in the landscape of my mind. And she didn't need to know. Some things make more sense in silence. Some things are clearer when they remain unspoken, untouched, quietly observed from just beyond the threshold of her awareness. And as the days moved forward, I found myself settling into that silence with an ease that surprised me. Realizing that the space between us wasn't empty at all, it was full of everything she never meant to reveal but did anyway. Simply by existing in the predictable way she always had. It was enough. More than enough. And it led naturally, inevitably, to the final part of this story. the morning when she woke up with the unmistakable sense that something had shifted. Something subtle and invisible, but real enough to unsettle her, even if she couldn't name what it was. But that's part 3. For now, this is where the noticing begins to settle into something colder, quieter, almost peaceful. She woke the next morning in that half-dreamed state where the room feels both familiar and slightly wrong, like a replica made from memory rather than the real thing. And I could tell even from where I stood, far enough not to be seen, close enough to understand that something in her tightened the second her eyes opened. Some small instinct rising before reason had time to catch up, and she lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling as if listening for a sound she wasn't even sure existed. I watched her shift under the blankets, pushing her hair off her face, blinking slowly the way she always did when waking didn't quite feel natural. And I recognized the subtle tension in her shoulders, a stiffness that hadn't been there before, like the air around her felt different even if she couldn't explain why. She moved through the morning in her usual sequence: kitchen, living room, bathroom, but there was a hesitation now, a fractional pause in each step, as though she were walking through a house that didn't fully belong to her, a place where someone had breathed a little too close to the walls. She checked her phone first, the way she always did, expecting notifications that weren't there, messages she might have been hoping for. Or maybe dreading, I couldn't tell, but when the screen stayed blank, something in her expression flickered, not disappointment, exactly, but something adjacent, something unsettled. I stayed where I was, steady and patient, letting the morning unfold the way mornings always do. And she made her tea with the same absent-minded concentration, though she stirred it longer than usual, watching the steam rise as if expecting it to reveal something. When she finally sat on the edge of her couch, she exhaled in this shallow, controlled way, like she was trying not to let her breath shake, and she kept glancing toward the balcony door, though nothing had changed there, nothing except the way she felt inside her own space. That was the shift, not in the room, not in the world, but in her. A quiet discomfort she couldn't justify, a sense of being observed without proof, noticed without reason. It was the kind of feeling people get when the patterns they trust become just slightly misaligned, when the familiar turns a shade unfamiliar. And although she tried to brush it off, I could see the way her fingers kept tapping the arm of the couch, restless, unsure. She stood up abruptly and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look into the street. And for a moment she scanned the quiet morning with the kind of searching gaze reserved for dreams that follow you into waking, the ones that feel like warnings even when they make no sense. She didn't see me. She wouldn't have even if she'd looked longer. I'd learned how to exist quietly, not hidden but unnoticed, occupying that thin space between presence and absence where people rarely think to look. She let the curtain fall, slower than usual, as if her body wasn't moving entirely under her own command, then turned back toward the room with a small frown on her face, an expression that told me she felt something was different even if she couldn't tell what. She walked to the kitchen again, opening cabinets she'd opened thousands of times, checking the contents as though expecting them to be out of place. They weren't. Everything was where it always was. That was the point. The familiarity only made the tension sharper, because it left her with no explanation, no evidence, only instinct. People trust their instincts less than they should. They dismiss the subtle prickle at the back of the neck, the sense of being watched, the quiet suspicion that the air feels heavier than before. She was doing exactly that, rationalizing, smoothing over the unease, telling herself she was tired from the trip, that the message she'd sent me and my silence afterward must have left her a little on edge. She didn't know my silence was deliberate. She didn't know how well silence could shape a space if you let it. She paced a little, something she rarely did, her steps light and quick across the floor, as though movement might dispel whatever clung to her mind. And watching her, I felt something close to satisfaction, not triumph, not vindication, but a steady, quiet calm, like observing a pattern complete itself after months of careful, unspoken attention. There was no malice in it, nothing sharp or vengeful, just the simple recognition that the distance between us, once filled with my restless wanting, had settled into something balanced, something still. I wasn't part of her life anymore, not in the active sense she would recognize, but she felt me in the room around her, in the silence I'd left behind, in the slight dissonance of a morning that should have felt normal but didn't, and that was enough. I watched as she stepped out onto the balcony, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild air, scanning the street again with that same uneasy attention. And this time there was a question in her expression, a subtle wondering she couldn't articulate. Was someone here? Has someone been close? And the beauty of it was that she didn't know why she felt that way, and she never would. She leaned on the railing, closed her eyes for a moment, and I could tell she was trying to steady her breathing, grounding herself in the physical world to quiet whatever intangible presence lingered at the edges of her awareness. When she finally went back inside, she locked the balcony door, something she almost never did. Then she checked the front door, not once but twice. She didn't even realize she'd done it. That's what quiet tension does, it rewrites behavior before the mind catches up. I remained where I was, steady, unhurried, the morning unfolding around us without urgency. I felt no pull to step closer, no need to reveal anything. Her unease was not fear. It was simply recognition, the mind sensing a shift without understanding it. A kind of final silence settling into place. This was the ending, not dramatic, not destructive, not loud. Just a soft, precise moment where she became aware of the space around her in a way she never had before. Aware that she'd never fully been alone in her routines. Aware that something had been near her life in ways she couldn't name. I stepped back then, letting the distance widen naturally, the world returning to its usual rhythm without disturbance. She would go through her day with that faint thread of tension woven through everything, a quiet puzzle she would never solve. She wouldn't tell her friends about it. She wouldn't mention it to anyone. It was too small, too subtle, too easy to brush off. But the sensation would stay with her, lingering at the edges of her thoughts, resurfacing in moments when she least expected it. And I would remain where I had always been, calm, steady, untroubled, watching not out of hunger or hurt but out of something quieter, something that felt almost like closure. There was no need for more. The story didn't end with confrontation or confession. It ended with awareness, with her waking into a silence shaped by everything she never saw and I never said, a silence that fit perfectly between us. And that was enough.